By default, Returnal does not perform well on Steam Deck, and it has led people to speculate about the future of games on the Steam Deck with articles saying things like, is the Steam Deck running out of steam when it comes to PlayStation Studios games? For me personally, I was struggling a bit trying to find some decent settings for this game, but thanks to a friend, I was able to get some that work pretty well. So let's talk about the problems with Returnal on deck and discuss whether these are problems that we'll see fixes for over time, or if the Steam Deck is really starting to meet its match with current generation exclusives. If you don't know by now, Returnal is not only a great game, it is by one of the most underrated studios in the business. Housemarque is responsible for genius arcade style titles like Super Stardust HD, Resogun, and Nex Machina. But when their more recent games didn't perform so well, they pivoted to creating a roguelike, which I think is actually a good fit for a studio used to making arcade games. A lot of the principles from an action arcade game can carry over well to an action roguelike. Derek Yu, the creator of Spelunky, famously employed arcade design principles in the seminal roguelike platformer. Thankfully, the pivot worked for Housemarque, and Returnal was the sales success that they needed it to be, leading many of us to be excited about a port to PC, even more so with the Steam Deck being a thing. Who wouldn't want to be able to play Returnal in a handheld fashion with an even more convenient way to suspend mid-run when needed? Our hopes have been tempered, however, by a litany of rough ports to PC, Forspoken, Dead Space, Hogwarts Legacy, and more. The only solace we had is that among those bad ports, Sony had been releasing absolutely stellar ports to the PC, all of which worked well on the Steam Deck. God of War, Spider-Man Remastered, Miles Morales, and Uncharted Legacy Collection have all launched after the release of the Steam Deck and have all played reasonably well on Steam Deck from day one. So the question becomes, can Returnal keep that streak up? First of all, I want to say that getting it to a consistent 30 would be a success for the Steam Deck, but to be honest, I'm not sure that's enough for this sort of game. Twitchy action games like this certainly beg to be played at 60 frames per second, and that is how I would personally prefer to play a game like this, but that's just out of the question for the Steam Deck, so let's set our sights to 30 FPS and then see how we can adjust from there. Finally, with regard to broader features, Returnal does support cloud saves, but it seems to store graphical settings and HUD settings in the cloud as well, which can be very frustrating. This even extends to the performance HUD, which I had on for the desktop but off for the Steam Deck, and it would flip-flop between the two. So yeah, again, very frustrating. Alright, getting into settings now, there are a ton of options. The first thing to note is that 800p is effectively the minimum resolution. Actually, the lowest you can go is 1280 by 768, but either way, if you try to force a lower resolution than that in the properties, you will be met with an error saying that you're below the minimum resolution. As I mentioned, the settings menu is pretty rich. You can enable a performance UI that shows up in a horizontal bar at the top, and therefore seems like it was absolutely modeled after the Steam Deck's own performance overlay. Moving on to graphics settings, image reconstruction options are slightly hidden in screen optimizations menu. I figured FSR is your best option on the Steam Deck, but I was wrong, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Finally, there is a really comprehensive benchmarking tool. It's broken up into 7 zones, each with their own theme. The first is lighting and shadows, the second is destructibles and volumetric fog, then animation and particles, then material VFX and reflection. Zone 5's theme is projectiles and beams, Zone 6 is enemies and projectiles, the last zone is mesh complexity. When I first launched the game, the default settings were 800p at full resolution with everything set to low. The only thing I changed was I disabled the VSync and set the cap to 90 to get an accurate max FPS. When I ran the benchmark at those settings, I got an average of 22 FPS, a max of 45, and a minimum of 2, so yeah, not good. The best results I got on my own were when I set FSR to performance, so 50% resolution, I disabled screen space reflections, and I did a cap at 30, which is going to result in a lower max, but hopefully better frame pacing where possible. The result I got was an average 27 FPS, max of 29, and a minimum of 14. The good thing here is that the lows were not nearly as low, but it was still pretty common to see frame rates in the low teens. It was especially bad in Zone 2 and Zone 3, so destructibles, volumetric fog, animation, and particles. Naturally, I ran several times and I got very similar results each time. The benchmark had glitchy animations, but I mostly didn't see this occur in real life gameplay, so don't mind those. Overall, I started to lose hope here, particularly because the GPU was on full board the entire time. It averaged a 96% load throughout the entire benchmark. The reason that's telling is because it implies that there's not much you're going to be able to do to improve performance from a player point of view. The problem isn't RAM, so cryo utilities may not be much help. The problem isn't CPU, so power tools shouldn't do much. And these benchmarks ran multiple times, so it's not just shader stutter either. The bottleneck is the GPU, and that means that in all likelihood, only a patch can improve performance. But just as I was about to give up, my friend Spine Duke linked me some settings from Reset Era. Shout out to Kurt Baboon for these settings because they turned out to be great. He was doing a couple things differently than I was. First is that he was using the slightly lower resolution of 1280 by 768 as opposed to 1280 by 800. Then was that he favored resolution scaling over FSR. I clearly didn't do enough testing with resolution scaling because yeah, without FSR you would free up some room on the GPU. But here's the funny one, he set the Steam Deck refresh rate to 55 so that he can set a cap of 27. This is clever because much of the time the game will hover around the 27 and 28 mark, so having a cap of 30 FPS won't do very much for your frame pacing, but setting it just a few frames lower might result in a very smooth graph. So trying that out in the benchmarking tool ended up being quite good. There was a lot more consistency across the board. Zone 2 and Zone 3 definitely still had severe dips, but this was enough to get me excited about some real life play. So moving over to trying to play some legitimate runs on the Steam Deck, the most remarkable thing that I found was in fact the frame pacing. I had my doubts about playing this below 60 FPS, so I was surprised to see that as long as the timing was consistent, I could execute a lot more of the challenging gameplay even at 27 FPS, at least in Biome 1 and Biome 2. You see, I'm still pretty early in terms of progress for this game, but this has me hopeful because there are some staggeringly large rooms in Biome 2 with lots of projectiles firing at you, and it's somewhat indicative of what you see in the late game. So here's what I'll do. I'll try to keep playing through exclusively on the Steam Deck and see if it's still playable in the late game. I've beaten the game quite a few times on PS5 now, and I still have a ton of that muscle memory, so I'll see how much progress I can make this weekend and report back to you next week. But what do you think? Have you played it yet? Do you think it will get improved? I definitely want to hear your experience so far. If this is too expensive for you, or you really want that white knuckle action at 60 FPS, then consider picking up Nex Machina. It's much cheaper at $20 and often goes on sale for $5. But yeah, with Returnal, I'd say this is still a really great port from Sony. It does have some issues, but it's better than the pattern that we've seen for other PC ports recently. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I covered this in depth in my last video, so check it out. Goodbye!